Dawn bleeds slowly through the clouds, thin metallic light over the wreckage of France. The road ahead isn't a road anymore, but a wound, a broken artery of churned mud and shattered stone. From horizon to horizon the trucks move. Olive-drab ghosts. Tires sink, engines roar, and the smell of diesel mixes with the rot of fields still haunted by war. Every few seconds a headlight flares against the fog, like the heartbeat of something enormous refusing to die. Inside one cab, a driver blinks hard to keep his eyes open. He hasn't slept in 30 hours. His hands, cracked and blackened, grip a steering wheel slick with oil and rain. The radio hisses and pops before a voice cuts through. Keep it moving. No stops, no rank, no explanation. Just the rule. Behind him 100 more trucks follow, bound together by that same order. The convoy crawls past burnt-out villages and fields still littered with helmets. Every truck carries fuel or food, each one the difference between motion and paralysis for 1,000,000 men at the front. Their engines moan beneath the weight like beasts under a whip. There is no rhythm, only necessity. Some drivers hum to stay awake. Others mutter prayers between the grinding of gears. They don't see themselves as heroes. They're just the pulse in a dying body, beating because stopping means death. Overhead thunder rolls. Not weather, but distant artillery. The men know it by sound alone. The front is always somewhere ahead, never far enough away. A bridge collapses behind them, swallowed by floodwater. A truck spins into a ditch and no one stops to help. The rule is absolute: keep the line alive. For every man stranded, 10 more depend on the cargo that must reach the front before sunrise. Discipline holds them together, but something deeper drives them forward. A defiance too tired to be called courage. It began as a logistical miracle, a desperate idea scribbled on a map after D-Day. The ports were choking with supplies, the armies starving for them. Between lay 200 miles of cratered earth and broken infrastructure. Command said it couldn't be done. Engineers said there weren't enough trucks, drivers, or fuel. But someone said yes anyway. They built a road that wasn't really a road, drew a circle and called it the Red Ball and dared physics to keep up. Now in the wet dawn, that defiance takes shape in the endless rumble of tires and engines. Each truck carries more than fuel. It carries the illusion of inevitability, the idea that the Allied advance cannot stop. Yet under every layer of mud and motion lies the truth. This system shouldn't exist. It was born of exhaustion, running on borrowed time, powered by men who had no choice but forward. And still they drive, through rain, fear, and disbelief, feeding an army that eats continents for breakfast. The impossible convoy, alive against all logic, rolls toward history. Victory had come too fast. After the breakout from Normandy, the Allies moved like a flood unchained. Patton's tanks devoured France at 50 miles a day, columns stretching so far the maps couldn't keep up. Liberated towns blurred into each other, Saint-Lô, Avranches, Chartres, each greeted by cheers, then left behind in clouds of dust and diesel smoke. For the first time since D-Day, it felt like the war was collapsing under its own weight. But inside that triumph lurked a slow disaster, invisible until the roar of engines began to fade. Fuel, always fuel, became the ghost no one could catch. The faster the armies advanced, the longer their lifeline stretched. Every gallon had to crawl from Normandy's beaches through bottlenecked roads, across shattered bridges, to feed machines that never slept. A Sherman burned 2 gallons a mile. A division needed 60,000 gallons a day. The math was obscene and the numbers didn't lie. By late August 1944, half the tanks that had liberated Paris were motionless, stranded in open fields. Engines idled dry. Commanders stood over maps stained with coffee and rain, tracing routes that no longer worked. The armies had outpaced their supplies. Momentum, their greatest weapon, had turned into a trap. In Eisenhower's headquarters, tension settled like smoke. The war rooms were lit with too many cigarettes, too many worried eyes. Commanders argued in circles. Patton demanded priority fuel allocations. His advance on the Meuse would, he swore, end the war by Christmas. Montgomery claimed his own operation in the north would strike the killing blow. Eisenhower listened, jaw clenched as his staff officers whispered the truth. There wasn't enough fuel for both. The war had shifted from strategy to arithmetic. In one corner of the room, the logisticians waited, men with pencils, slide rules, and sleepless eyes. For months they had been treated as clerks, not soldiers. Now the fate of Europe sat in their ledgers. They spoke in tonnage, not tactics, in gallons, not glory. We can move men, one of them said quietly, or we can move fuel, but not both. Outside on the ruined roads of France, the illusion of momentum shattered. Trucks sank axle-deep in mud. Drivers abandoned vehicles to scavengers and civilians. Gasoline cans, jerrycans became the new currency. Pilfered, traded, hoarded. Soldiers siphoned fuel from one tank to another, like blood transfusions between dying patients. Every command decision echoed with a physical cost. Another halted advance, another day lost, even nature joined the enemy. Rains came early that autumn, turning roads into rivers. Convoys stalled for hours as bulldozers clawed at the muck. Bridges collapsed under their own repairs. In the distance, artillery rumbled, a reminder that the Germans, though retreating, were not yet defeated. They waited for the moment when the Allied engine would sputter for good, and yet, amid the paralysis, something began to shift. The humiliation of logistics officers became their power. For the first time, generals listened to the quiet men with grease under their nails and numbers in their heads. The conversation changed from where to strike to how to feed the strike. Doctrine bent under the pressure of necessity. The Allies had to reinvent their war from the ground up. Supply could no longer follow combat. It had to lead it. Somewhere between desperation and ingenuity, a handful of officers sketched the first outlines of a radical solution. One road, one direction, endless motion. In the dim glow of the staff tent, a pencil circled a line on the map and drew it back to the ports of Normandy. Someone murmured, half in hope, half in disbelief, "We'll build a road that never stops." The room fell silent. The momentum that had nearly killed them would be reborn, not as chaos but as order. The convoy had not yet begun, but its pulse could already be felt beneath the mud. It began not with a battle but with a pencil. In a damp operations tent near Cherbourg, maps of France lay scattered across a wooden table, edges curling under candlelight. The air smelled of wet wool, coffee, and exhaustion. For hours the officers had argued in circles. Too few trucks, too little fuel, too many miles. Someone cursed the mud. Another blamed the roads. The sound of rain on canvas made the silence heavier. Then a logistics major, young, sharp, and too tired to care about protocol, dragged the pencil in a wide loop across the map. "One road," he muttered. "Just one way out, one way back." The room turned. What he drew was absurd. A single arterial loop running from Cherbourg's ports to the forward depots near Chartres, a closed circuit that never stopped moving. No traffic in reverse, no interference. Just motion. Someone snorted, "Impossible." The colonel beside him leaned closer. "You're talking about a road that eats itself." "Yes," the major replied. "As long as it keeps feeding the front." The concept defied every rule of wartime logistics. Doctrine demanded order, staging areas, rest cycles, permissions. But the doctrine had already failed them. Fuel was rotting on the beaches while tanks died in the fields. The idea, mad as it was, offered the one thing no system had yet managed: rhythm. Arguments erupted. Senior officers scoffed that the French roads couldn't handle it. Someone pointed out the danger of accidents, breakdowns, bottlenecks. The major didn't flinch. "They'll keep moving," he said. "Even if it means driving on the shoulders. Even if it means running at night." No stops. That word, no stops, hung in the air like a challenge to gravity. The general stared at the map. The loop looked fragile, like a thread drawn too tight, ready to snap. Yet there was something hypnotic about its simplicity. The colonel reached for his cigarette, drew one last drag, and exhaled. "We'd have to mark it," he said quietly. "Keep civilians out, redirect everything else." The major nodded. "We'll paint a red circle on every vehicle. Everyone who sees it moves aside. A red circle, bright, defiant, unmistakable. A symbol of motion and warning both." Within hours, someone gave it a name. The Red Ball route, borrowed from railroad slang for high-priority freight. By dawn, the name stuck like prophecy. When the plan reached headquarters, laughter came first. Eisenhower's deputy called it lunacy wrapped in gasoline. But one general, an engineer by trade, didn't laugh. He studied the loop, then the faces in the room. Men hollowed by fatigue, but lit with something that looked like faith. He signed the order without ceremony. "Make it real," he said, "and God help the man who gets in their way." Outside, the rain eased. Trucks waited in the distance, lined like patient beasts. No one knew yet what the Red Ball would cost, only that it would move or die trying. The age of improvisation had begun. Before the Red Ball had a legend, it had men. Ordinary soldiers who were never meant to be remembered. They arrived by the hundreds, stepping off trains into the wet dawns of Normandy. Mechanics, truckers, cooks, farmers, boys from Detroit and Georgia and Chicago. Most wore the same patch on their sleeve. Service battalions, colored troops. The Army called them non-combatants. The front-line soldiers called them the lifeline. They didn't carry rifles into battle. They carried everything else. Their world was made of motion and mud. Engines were their weapons, wrenches their ammunition. At night they worked by flashlight, hands deep in the guts of broken trucks. Grease crawled under their fingernails, never coming out. Rain pooled beneath them, and the smell of oil mixed with the sour stench of spent fuel. They cursed the weather, the trucks, and sometimes the officers who spoke to them as if they were invisible, but they kept the wheels turning. Without them, the Red Ball would have been just another line on a map. Private James "Slim" Harris remembered the first night he drove. "They told us if you stop, you die," he'd later say. So we didn't. He was 21, his hands too big for the gloves they'd given him, his truck older than he was. The convoy stretched for miles, headlights dimmed to slits, engines growling in a kind of mechanical prayer. Rain hammered the windshield until the world was nothing but noise and mud. Yet the trucks moved, always forward, always moving. The irony was never lost on them. Many of these men had grown up in a country that denied them a seat at the table they were now risking their lives to defend. They could die in uniform but not eat beside the men they supplied. Even the Red Ball itself was segregated. White units at the depots, black drivers on the road. But inside the cabs, where diesel drowned out orders, race blurred into fatigue. There were no ranks in the dark, only men trying to keep the line alive. They built roads as they drove them. Bulldozers flattened craters, engineers reinforced bridges with scavenged lumber, and when a truck broke down, men would strip it bare, parts cannibalized to keep another vehicle running. There was no time for repair shops, no luxury of replacement. Every nut, every spark plug, every gallon mattered. When supplies ran short, they made their own tools. A hammer carved from scrap steel, a wrench bent back into shape with a rifle butt. Improvisation became their doctrine. The rhythm of the Red Ball was punishing. 20 hours on the road, 4 hours of rest if you were lucky. Convoys ran through the night like arteries of fire, red circles flashing on mud-splattered doors. Men learned to drive half asleep, one hand on the wheel, the other steadying a cigarette. They joked to stay sane. They sang to stay awake. Some wrote letters home that began, "Don't worry, Ma, I'm just driving," as if driving through a war wasn't its own kind of combat. Shells sometimes found them anyway. The front was never as far away as it looked on the maps. When mortars fell near the convoys, they didn't scatter. They pressed the accelerator harder, engines screaming over the sound of impact. There were no medals for what they did, only miles. By autumn, the Red Ball Express was no longer an experiment. It was a living thing. It breathed diesel and sweat, spoke in the language of gears and courage. And the men who kept it alive, those so-called labor troops, had become something more than soldiers. They were the invisible spine of victory, the proof that endurance could be its own kind of heroism. Ahead waited more trucks, more road, more miles. The machines would take center stage next, but without these men, there would have been nothing to move at all. They called them deuce-and-a-half 2.5-ton GMC CCKWs that rattled, roared, and coughed their way across France like metal mules. Built for burden, not beauty. A steel skeleton on 6 wheels, canvas skin stretched over the ribs. They weren't fast or comfortable or graceful, but they were stubborn. When the road gave way, the trucks clawed forward. When bridges collapsed, they found fords. When nothing else worked, they did. Each truck was assigned a number, a route, a driver, and unofficially a soul. Men gave them names like Betsy, Sweet Lorraine, Iron Annie. They painted pin-ups and home addresses on the dashboards, taped family photos beside the fuel gauges. The trucks became companions, faithful, unpredictable, always hungry. 1,000 tiny problems lurked under every hood. Spark plugs fouled, fan belts snapped, carburetors flooded, and there were never enough spare parts, never enough time. Ingenuity became survival. Drivers turned scavengers, mechanics turned alchemists. One man welded a muffler from an old artillery shell. Another used a German helmet as a brake reservoir cap. When rubber ran short, they cut inner tubes into strips and tied them as seals. Fuel lines were extended with bits of hose wrapped in cloth to keep from leaking. Nothing matched, but everything worked, barely. The trucks ran on improvisation and profanity, held together by willpower and wire. At night, they hummed like insects, an unbroken procession of engines purring under low clouds. Each truck followed the glow of the taillight ahead, a red flicker bobbing through the dark. To lose that light was to vanish. Convoys moved in rhythm, 50 yards between each heartbeat, a mechanical symphony of pistons and fear. The Red Ball Express wasn't a road, it was an organism. Fuel flowed through it like blood, trucks the arteries, drivers the pulse. But fragility haunted every mile. One stalled engine could clog the system, a single overturned truck turning a highway into a choke point stretching for miles. When that happened, the men didn't wait for orders. They jumped down, pushed, cursed, hauled the wreck aside. The Red Ball had no patience for hesitation. It demanded constant motion. Even the smallest failure could ripple outward. Somewhere, a tank would stop firing because a truck had stalled in the mud. The engineers tried to keep pace. They painted red balls on signs every few miles, erected makeshift repair pits, burned out their own machines trying to sustain the rest. But the math never balanced. The trucks consumed themselves faster than they could be rebuilt. They were like horses running beyond exhaustion, too necessary to rest, too vital to stop. Still, every morning the lines formed again. Diesel smoke rose over the hills like a gray prayer. The convoy was alive, fragile, unstoppable. Each machine bore its scars, its dents, its patchwork repairs, 1,000 silent stories of men who refused to let them die. And soon, those machines would face their first real enemy, not mud or breakdown, but gunfire. The Red Ball's heartbeat was about to meet its baptism by fire. The Red Ball Express met its first test not on a schedule, but in an ambush. August 1944, Morton. The Germans weren't finished. Their retreat had teeth, and their counterattack came like a hammer through fog. Panzer divisions surged west, cutting through the hedgerows, desperate to split the Allied spearhead. The front bent, folded, nearly broke, and suddenly the Red Ball's rear line highway ran straight into the war. Night fell thick and dirty. The convoys rolled under blackout orders, headlights slitted to knife-thin glows. Rain hissed on the hoods, engines hummed low, and the air stank of diesel and tension. Each driver knew the rule: keep it moving. No stops, no exceptions. The doctrine said supply lived behind the guns, but the road no longer recognized doctrine. Out here, behind and ahead blurred together. Private Harris gripped his steering wheel until his knuckles went white. His convoy, 30 trucks hauling fuel and rations, snaked along a narrow French lane lined with blackened trees. The sound reached them first, a distant rumble that wasn't thunder. Then a flash, then another. Mortar fire. The ground jumped beneath the tires, mud spattering across windshields. Someone shouted into the radio, half static, half panic. "Ambush, keep driving. Don't stop." The first shell landed short, the second found the road. Harris felt the concussion rattle his chest. The truck ahead vanished into smoke. He didn't think, he shifted up, stomped the pedal, and drove blind. The convoy compressed into chaos. Engines screaming, gears grinding, explosions chasing their heels. Men yelled, ducked, prayed, but no one stopped. Villages blurred past, ghost towns burning in silence. Somewhere a church bell clanged, its tower half collapsed. The road twisted through fields where cows lay still, half buried in ash. The trucks roared on, dodging craters, their covered headlights bouncing against the darkness like desperate heartbeats. The Red Ball insignia on each door glowed faintly under soot, a promise to the men ahead. We're still coming. Doctrine had no answers for this. Supply wasn't supposed to fight, yet the drivers learned their own kind of warfare. When machine gun fire burst from the tree line, they didn't break. They swerved, ducked, and kept moving. A truck hit by shrapnel was pushed aside. Another took its place. When bridges collapsed, they built ramps from wreckage and kept rolling. Logistics in that moment became combat art, improvised, brutal, and alive. By dawn, the road was littered with burned-out shells of trucks and the twisted metal of courage. Harris's convoy made it through, half the vehicles gone, every driver shaken. They offloaded fuel under shell fire, dumped crates of ammunition into trenches, then turned around to drive back the same road. There was no victory ceremony, no flag, no medal, just the order, load again. The Red Ball Express had survived its baptism by fire, and in doing so, had become something new. It was no longer just a supply chain, it was a front of its own, a continuous beating artery under constant attack. The men learned to treat danger as routine, explosions as punctuation. Fear became a background hum as mechanical as the engines themselves. What doctrine called support, the drivers now called survival. They had crossed a line that no manual could define. When a driver keeps going through gunfire not out of duty, but out of defiance. That was the birth of mastery, not clean, not planned, but earned in sweat and steel and smoke. From that night on, the Red Ball convoys moved differently. The fear didn't fade, it simply found rhythm. Chaos had become part of the route, another curve in the endless road that led forward, always forward. The Red Ball Express found its rhythm in exhaustion. What began as improvisation hardened into ritual, a mechanical heartbeat pulsing across France. Day and night the convoys rolled. From Cherbourg's docks to the depots near Chartres, 2,000 trucks moved in a constant loop, hauling 12,000 tons of everything an army could devour. Ammunition, fuel, food, tires, soap, coffee. The arteries of war pulsed with motion, the sound of engines never fading, not even in sleep. They called it the loop. Dispatch whistles shrieked every hour, sending new convoys into the dark. Tires spun, mud sprayed, gears shrieked like wounded animals. Mechanics worked under floodlights that turned their faces ghost white, welding in silence while engines idled behind them like impatient beasts. Men learned to sleep standing, helmets tilted forward, one hand resting on a fender still warm from the road. The trucks never truly stopped. They only paused long enough to inhale. Repetition became survival. Start, load, drive, unload, return, repeat. One driver called it a dance of madness. The same roads, the same potholes, the same fog, every day blurring into the next. Yet there was beauty in the motion, a strange grace in the way the convoys moved. They'd pull out of depots like notes in a score, 30 trucks per column, 50 yards apart, each red circle flashing in rhythm. It was war-turned choreography, chaos disguised as order. The human body wasn't meant for this tempo. Eyes burned, hands trembled, knees stiffened from constant clutch work. Some men hallucinated, the taillight ahead morphing into a red ghost that led them through darkness. They drove through storms, through frost, through the kind of fatigue that made thought dangerous. And still they drove. Because if one man stopped, 100 more would follow. The Red Ball didn't forgive hesitation. Commanders marveled at the numbers, 12,000 tons a day. 1 million men fed, fueled, and armed without pause. It looked perfect on the reports, clean and mathematical. But the truth was messy, human, soaked in diesel and sweat. The drivers didn't see statistics. They saw the road stretching endlessly before them, a single command etched into their bones. Keep it moving. The irony deepened with every mile. The more the Red Ball succeeded, the less anyone noticed. Frontline soldiers fired, advanced, and ate without wondering where their fuel came from. Generals praised supply efficiency in press briefings, never naming the men who made it happen. The convoy became invisible, its perfection erasing its presence. Yet within that invisibility was pride. The drivers didn't need applause. Their satisfaction came from rhythm, from mastery, from knowing that as long as the trucks moved, the war moved. They had turned chaos into cadence, exhaustion into motion, impossibility into routine. And like all routines born from desperation, it couldn't last. Metal wears. Flesh breaks. The same rhythm that kept them alive would soon begin to tear them apart. The Red Ball Express was still rolling strong, but beneath the roar of engines, something fragile was starting to crack. By autumn of 1944, the road had turned against them. The Red Ball Express, once a symbol of speed and defiance, was now a trail of fatigue and ruin. The rains came early, thickening the mud until it swallowed the tires whole. Roads that had once thrummed with motion cracked under their own weight, torn apart by endless convoys, stripped bare by repetition. The land itself seemed to reject the burden. Engines began to fail. The trucks, overworked and underfed, coughed black smoke into the gray sky. Mechanics scavenged graveyards of steel, pulling parts from wrecks to keep others alive. Every vehicle that died was cannibalized, each stripped bolt a quiet confession that they were running out of time. The road was littered with broken axles and twisted frames, half buried like bones of a great machine that had finally run itself to death. The men weren't faring much better. Sleep had become a rumor. Drivers dozed with their eyes open, steering by instinct and luck. Some dreamed while awake, seeing phantom roads and phantom lights. Others collapsed mid-route, waking to find their truck still rolling. Accidents multiplied, head-on collisions, overturned loads, trucks sliding off embankments in the fog. Each crash was a small tragedy, quickly forgotten, buried under the weight of the next convoy. Fuel, once plentiful, became sacred. Every gallon was counted, guarded, fought over. Thieves appeared like shadows. Locals, deserters, even Allied soldiers desperate for a few cans to barter. A full tanker was now worth more than a man's life. The Red Ball had become what it was built to fight, a system feeding on itself. The very lifeline of the army was draining the strength of its own veins. At headquarters, the debates grew louder. Eisenhower's staff argued that the convoy had reached its limit. The war was advancing toward Germany, new ports were opening, and rail lines were being rebuilt. Some called for the Red Ball to be dismantled, a relic of a desperate summer. But others hesitated. They knew that ending it would mean admitting how much it had cost and how much of that cost could never be repaid. The question hung in the air like smoke. How much can you take from a man before he breaks? For the drivers, the answer came not in words but in silence. Convoys left later moved slower. Laughter disappeared from the depots. The music that once echoed from truck radios faded into static. Men went through motions by habit, the rhythm now hollow. They had conquered exhaustion, but not without losing something of themselves in the process. And yet, even in collapse, the road still called to them. They couldn't quite stop, not yet. There was dignity in the motion, even when it hurt. To drive was to belong, to defy the limits that command could never understand. The Red Ball Express was unraveling, but within its ruin lay the seed of its redemption. For what these men built, through exhaustion, madness, and sheer endurance, would outlast them all. The convoy might end, but its rhythm had already written itself into history. When the Red Ball Express finally slowed to a halt, it didn't die. It transformed. The trucks stopped, but their rhythm echoed through every map, manual, and doctrine the U.S. Army would write for decades to come. What began as a desperate improvisation became the blueprint for modern warfare. The chaos that once terrified commanders was studied, dissected, and reborn as science. In the months after the roads quieted, logistics officers gathered their notes, fuel reports scribbled in margins, breakdown tallies etched into torn ledger books, route timings remembered from exhaustion. They pieced together what they had created without realizing it. The world's first high-speed one-way logistics network. A living artery sustained by motion, fed by trust. Every ton delivered, every truck salvaged, every rule broken in the name of efficiency became the foundation for something bigger. They called it throughput logistics. The idea that supplies must flow continuously, like a current rather than pile up in stagnant depots. The lessons were brutal but brilliant. Maintenance couldn't wait for breakdowns. It had to be built into the movement. Repair units became mobile hospitals for machines. Dispatch stations became nerve centers. Even the color coding, the red circle, would echo in future. Convoy markings across the world, from the ashes of fatigue rose doctrine, the Army. Transportation Corps formalized. Rolling supply, dedicated routes, and one-direction highways. The lessons of the Red Ball reached Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, and beyond. Each war fought with systems that owed their pulse to those mud-choked roads of 1944. What was once impossible had become standard operating procedure, and the parallels didn't stop at history. Decades later, when the military began testing autonomous supply convoys and aerial resupply drones, engineers quoted Red Ball reports. "Speed is discipline," one memo read. Words first muttered by a weary driver 70 years before. In every hum of a modern logistics hub, every sensor tracking fuel loads in real time, the spirit of the convoy lived on. Yet behind that progress lingered something quieter, an ache of memory. The men who made the system work were rarely invited into the classrooms that studied them. Their names didn't appear in the footnotes of doctrine. The African-American drivers, the mechanics who worked by flashlight, the officers who risked their careers on an untested idea, most faded into obscurity. The machine was immortal. Its creators were not. Still, the legend endured in other ways. Every modern soldier who has driven a convoy down a hostile road, every logistician who's kept an army alive far from home, owes a debt to those men who refused to stop. The Red Ball Express proved that logistics was not the quiet part of war. It was the heartbeat. The road itself is gone now, reclaimed by fields and silence. But the idea, motion as life, endurance as doctrine, remains. The convoy that shouldn't have existed became the model for every that followed. Its rhythm still hums beneath the world's armies, a low mechanical prayer whispered in steel and dust. And somewhere between invention and sacrifice lies the final truth. Even the most temporary miracles can become permanent. Long after the guns went quiet, the road remained. Not the asphalt. Most of that was torn up, reclaimed by weeds and silence, but the memory of motion, a ghostly hum that seemed to echo through the French countryside. The Red Ball Express had delivered victory mile by mile, ton by ton, until even triumph had grown weary. What remained were traces, ruts carved deep into the earth, rusted fuel drums half buried in ditches, the skeletons of trucks left to rot where they'd fallen. Rain gathers in their hollow beds now. Grass curls through their frames. The red circle, once bright and defiant, has faded to a dull rust, the color of dried blood. Birds nest in the cabins where drivers once sang themselves awake. If you stand close enough on a still morning, you might imagine the sound. Engines coughing to life, gears grinding. The chorus of motion that once fed a million men. History remembers the victories by name. Normandy, Paris, the Ardennes. It remembers Patton's speed, Montgomery's maneuvers, Eisenhower's decisions. But the road that bound them together has no monument, no statue in marble. Its heroes were anonymous men who lived in the blur between days, who counted distance instead of glory. They fought no battles, yet they sustained everyone. They were mechanics and drivers, laborers and dreamers. Many were black soldiers who wore the uniform of a country that didn't yet see them as equals. Yet on that road hierarchy dissolved. The only measure of worth was whether you kept the wheels turning. In that relentless rhythm, they found a kind of freedom no order could give and no policy could take away. They didn't fight for medals or speeches. They fought to keep others moving. The Red Ball Express was never meant to last, it was built to burn itself out. But in doing so, it revealed something eternal. That victory in war is less about destruction than endurance. The generals could command armies, the tanks could break lines, but none of it mattered without the quiet pulse of supply. For every soldier who advanced, a driver somewhere was wrestling a gear shift through mud, keeping the promise alive. There's a humility in that kind of heroism, a purity stripped of recognition. It's the same humility found in the way the men shared cigarettes at midnight, or patched each other's tires in silence, or kept driving even when fear had worn their nerves raw. In every battle, there are those who hold the line and those who keep it alive. The Red Ball men were both. Now decades later, modern wars move by air and satellite. Supply is invisible, instantaneous. But the soul of logistics, the heartbeat of endurance, was born on that French road. The drones and data networks that sustain armies today owe their lineage to a convoy of trucks driven by men who refuse to quit. Progress owes its rhythm to their exhaustion. In museums, their photographs hang in quiet corners, faces half-shadowed, hands resting on steering wheels. The captions are brief, but the eyes tell the story. Determination without glory, fatigue without surrender. They were not celebrated then, and they ask for no celebration now. Their monument is the road itself, paved in sacrifice and motion. As the rain falls on that lone, rusting truck, the earth seems to breathe around it. The wind carries the faint scent of oil, the ghost of movement. The road may have ended, but its lesson endures. That sometimes the greatest courage is not in the charge, but in the drive. Not in the taking of life, but in the giving of motion. They didn't fight for fame. They fought to keep the road alive.